I moved into this neighborhood 5 years ago, thinking it would be the perfect place to raise my family. The homes were charming, the lawns well kept, and everything about the community screamed peaceful. It was one of those gated communities where you think you're paying for tranquility, safety, and a sense of order. What I didn't realize back then was that we were also paying for an HOA that operated more like a dictatorship than a homeowners association. At first, it was just passive-aggressive newsletters and oddly specific community rules. Nothing too outrageous. Just odd. The HOA had this weird obsession with uniformity. You couldn't paint your door without approval. Your grass couldn't be half an inch too tall. Your mailbox had to be the same dull bronze color as everyone else's, or you'd get a fine. It was annoying, sure, but most of us just played along. We paid our dues, stayed quiet, and hoped they'd leave us alone. My wife used to laugh and call them the neighborhood hall monitors. I should have known back then. People who love rules that much eventually start abusing them. Despite all their absurd regulations, we genuinely tried to be good neighbors. We went to the cookouts, waved at everyone, and followed the rules, mostly. But the moment my daughter, Emily, decided to plant a small vegetable garden in our backyard, something completely harmless, that's when the HOA turned its eyes on us. It started with a letter saying the garden was unsightly and unapproved. Then came a $1,000 fine for unregistered agricultural activity. Yes, they called tomatoes and basil agriculture. I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just a mistake or some power-hungry board member having a bad day. I ignored the fine, assuming they'd eventually come to their senses. After all, what kind of organization penalizes a family for growing food in their own backyard? Turns out, this HOA wasn't just petty, it was vengeful. They didn't like being ignored. They wanted submission, and they were about to escalate things in a way I never expected. One afternoon, I came home from work and found an HOA notice, taped to my door in bold red letters. It was another citation, this time for violation of community energy standards. I had no idea what that even meant. I didn't respond. And that, apparently, was enough to set them off. That Sunday night, just as we were sitting down for dinner, everything went dark. Lights out. No warning. The entire house lost power. At first, I thought it was just a neighborhood outage. I looked outside and all the other homes were lit up, like Christmas. Just ours was dark. Confused, I checked the breakers. Nothing tripped. I called the utility company and they said, "Sir, your service was disconnected by request of the property authority listed on file." Property authority? That's when it hit me. The HOA had gone behind our backs and claimed authority to cut our power. I couldn't believe it. They had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. It wasn't just about rules anymore. They had endangered my family. My youngest son, Luke, had a respiratory machine he needed at night. We had to rush him to my parents' house across town, just so he could sleep safely. That was the moment something inside me shifted. It wasn't just about my rights anymore. It was personal. They had declared war, and they had no idea who they were messing with. By Monday morning, I wasn't angry. I was surgical. I sat at the head of my desk, staring at the framed photos on the wall behind me. One of them was from the grand opening of the Rivergate Power Facility, the largest privately owned energy plant in the county. My name was engraved on the plaque as Chief Executive Officer. For the past 12 years, I had overseen operations for one of the most critical infrastructure systems in our state. That HOA didn't just mess with a regular homeowner. They tried to humiliate and sabotage the man who literally keeps their lights on. Most people don't understand how energy grids are structured. They assume there's some faceless mega corporation behind the power supply, when in reality, a surprising amount of local power is handled by contracted providers, like mine. Rivergate provides electricity to over 130,000 homes, including every single property in my HOA's jurisdiction. That means their streetlights, community clubhouse, security systems, and yes, even the coffee maker in the HOA office were powered by my company. And by extension, by me. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to scream or threaten. I just needed to check the bylaws and operate within the framework of my company's policies. Fortunately for me, I had designed those policies. HOA interference with residential electrical access was a direct violation of both our corporate agreement and state law. What they did wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. And that gave me leverage. Delicious, lawful leverage. I called an emergency meeting with my legal team and executive staff. Within 2 hours, we gathered every shred of documentation: the HOA's unauthorized disconnection order, their prior fines, their letters of harassment. I had a full legal brief drafted by lunchtime. My general counsel, a no-nonsense woman named Carol, who had taken down corrupt politicians before breakfast, looked me in the eye and said, "You can bury them, legally and publicly." That was all I needed to hear. I wasn't interested in taking the whole neighborhood down, just the rotten core of its HOA board. I issued an internal directive to begin a full audit of the energy consumption and compliance records for the HOA-managed properties. I also authorized temporary hold orders on service to their non-residential facilities pending the outcome of the audit, which meant no more lights in the HOA clubhouse, no electricity for the heated pool, and most satisfying of all, no working air conditioning in the office they love to micromanage from. Still, I wanted to give them a chance to admit fault and back down. So I sent an official letter on Rivergate letterhead directly to the president of the HOA, a smug man named Gregory Tate, who once fined a 75-year-old woman for having wind chimes. The letter explained the situation in calm, legal terms and requested an immediate meeting to resolve the violations and reinstate my home's service. The response I received? A printed form letter stating all actions taken by the HOA were consistent with our community standards. They didn't just double down, they poured gasoline on the fire. At that point, I knew they thought I was bluffing. They didn't understand who I was. Maybe they thought I was just another resident with a good lawyer. They had no clue that every kilowatt hour powering their precious little community flowed through systems I helped build, manage, and oversee. That my name was on every major licensing document tied to the substation just 3 blocks from their office. That I knew how to legally bring their empire to its knees with a single phone call. So that's exactly what I did. I called Carol and said, "Initiate Phase 1. That's what we named it. Half as a joke, half as a strategy. Phase 1 meant immediate suspension of non-residential power under technical review. Publicly, it would look like a routine compliance issue. Internally, it was a warning shot. Within 24 hours, the HOA clubhouse went dark. The gym was useless. The pool heater stopped working. Gregory Tate sent out a panicked mass email about a grid malfunction. I nearly laughed when I read it, but I wasn't finished. That night, I drove past the HOA office. Inside, I saw board members sweating in their chairs under dead ceiling fans, typing frantically into laptops with rapidly draining batteries. Outside, the only light came from the homes of residents, power still. Flowing as usual, just not to the nerve center of their authority. It was poetic. They had weaponized their power to bully my family. Now I had stripped theirs away without raising my voice. And this was just the beginning. They had messed with my home, my family, my peace. They thought I was just another victim of their petty control. What they didn't realize, what they never saw coming, was that I had built the very system they relied on to keep their false sense of superiority alive. And now, that system belonged to me. The morning after the clubhouse blackout, the phone calls started rolling in. First it was the residents, confused, mildly annoyed. Then came the HOA board members, less confused and much more panicked. Gregory Tate tried to call me personally. I didn't answer. I let it ring again and again, just to remind him what silence sounded like. Then he sent an email with the subject line, "Urgent. HOA infrastructure failure. I forwarded it to Carol, along with a simple message. Let them sweat. By noon, Gregory and 2 other board members showed up at my office without an appointment. They were told I was unavailable due to executive matters, which wasn't a lie. I was in my office, watching them on the security feed while sipping coffee. The irony was too good. These people, who had demanded absolute compliance from everyone in the neighborhood, were now powerless and begging for answers from the man they tried to humiliate. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Later that day, I authorized Phase 2. This phase involved notifying local media outlets of a pending investigation into HOA corruption and illegal manipulation of utility access. I didn't even need to name names, just the mention of power being weaponized against residents was enough for 2 journalists to pick up the story. That night, headlines like "Local HOA abuses authority to cut families' power" started circulating online. I didn't leak anything. Confidential, I didn't have to. The narrative practically wrote itself. And while the HOA scrambled to do damage control, I began the legal process to formally suspend their preferential utility rates. You see, HOA properties usually get discounted service packages for common areas. But those rates require ethical standing and compliance. They had violated both. So I pulled the plug, literally and figuratively. Their monthly bill tripled overnight. I even added a surcharge for emergency audits and infrastructure review. It was petty, it was brutal, and it was completely legal. Residents began knocking on my door, some angry, some apologetic. Most were just confused. I sat a few of them down and explained what the HOA had done to my family. One woman started crying. She'd just been fined $500 for leaving her garbage bins out a few hours too long. Another man confessed they were pressured into siding with the board just to avoid being targeted. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me. The entire community had been held hostage by these bureaucratic tyrants. So I decided to take things a step further. I called for a neighborhood-wide meeting, independent of the HOA. No official documents, no board oversight, just residents gathering in my backyard to finally talk without fear. Over 50 people showed up. We shared stories, frustrations, and for the first time, solutions. By the end of the night, we had formed an informal coalition, not to burn the HOA down, but to dismantle it legally and permanently. The next week, I worked with Carol to draft a motion of no confidence. Under the HOA's own bylaws, if a certain percentage of homeowners vote to remove the board, they're out. No lawyers, no delays. Just democracy. We hit that percentage in 4 days. I personally delivered the signed petition to the HOA office with a flashlight because their power was still off. Gregory took one look at the signatures and turned pale. He didn't say a word. He knew. With the board facing imminent removal and the media heat intensifying, the remaining members began resigning one by one. The president was the last to go. He released a weak public statement blaming miscommunication and operational misunderstandings. No apology, no accountability. But that was fine. I wasn't looking for an apology. I was looking for results, and I got them. Shortly after, our new resident-elected board restored power access policies, removed the ridiculous fines, and even refunded some of the previous penalties. The HOA was effectively defanged. They still existed on paper, but they no longer ruled with fear. The residents got their voices back. And my family? We got our peace back. For the first time in years, the neighborhood actually felt like a community. But I never forgot how far they were willing to go just to flex their power, and I made sure they never forgot who flipped the switch. It took weeks for everything to settle. The HOA board was gone, their influence shattered, and the new leadership, comprised of actual residents who cared, began the process of repairing the damage. Still, the memory of what had been done to my family lingered. The sleepless nights, the panicked rush to get my son to safety, the dark, powerless silence they forced upon my home. It wasn't something I could easily forgive. But justice had been served, and in many ways, that was more satisfying than revenge. After the dust settled, I was approached by the local news station for an interview. They wanted to highlight what they were calling a David versus Goliath story with a twist. I wasn't interested in fame, but I agreed on one condition. I wouldn't be named directly. The focus had to be on community empowerment, not some personal victory lap. The piece aired that weekend, featuring interviews with several residents who talked about the fear they'd lived under and the relief they now felt. It was powerful, and it sent a clear message to HOAs everywhere. The people still have power. Behind the scenes, I initiated a policy shift at Rivergate. We revised our partnership terms to include new protective clauses for residential customers. If any HOA or third party attempted to manipulate service access without direct consent from the homeowner, it would be considered a breach of contract and referred to the State Energy Commission. In other words, what happened to my family would never happen to anyone else on my grid again. I turned my personal experience into corporate policy, and I didn't charge anyone extra for the protection. Over the next few months, life slowly returned to normal. My daughter's garden became a neighborhood project. The community kids helped her plant new vegetables, and every Saturday morning we'd host a harvest table out front, offering free produce to anyone who stopped by. It became more than a garden. It became a symbol of resistance, of how something as small as a tomato plant could spark a revolution against tyranny. Even the most skeptical neighbors began to smile again. As for Gregory Tate, the former HOA president, he moved out quietly under the cover of night. Word got around that he'd been reported for several financial irregularities regarding HOA funds. I didn't press charges. I didn't need to. His reputation was destroyed, and the people he once lorded over now looked at him with pity, or, worse, indifference. His era of control was over, and he left behind nothing but bitter memories and an empty office. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy some of it. Watching the tables turn, seeing the smug wiped off their faces. But more than anything, I was proud. Proud that I had chosen the high ground without sacrificing strength. Proud that I used my resources not for destruction, but for transformation. The power I held wasn't just in voltage or grid access. It was in knowing how to fight back intelligently, with precision and dignity. One evening, I stood in my backyard, watching the sunset as the garden lights flickered on, lights powered by the very grid they once tried to use against me. My wife came out with 2 glasses of tea, and we sat together, in silence, just enjoying the peace. No HOA notices, no threats, no fear. Just the hum of electricity and the sound of children playing down the street. It felt earned. It felt right. People still ask me if I regret not going further, if I should have sued, bankrupted the HOA, or burned their entire system down. But I don't believe in scorched earth. I believe in restoration. What we did was bigger than revenge. We showed people that you don't have to accept injustice just because it wears a badge or hides behind bylaws. You can fight back, and you can win. My name never made it into official records. But in the neighborhood, they still talk about that one blackout. That one Sunday when everything went dark, except for one house. The house they thought they could silence. The house that flipped the switch on them instead. And to this day, whenever I drive past the old HOA office, I smile. Because I know, every time they turn on a light, they remember who controls the power.